All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. I do educational videos, and they focus on great theories of everything from all time periods, usually things that you haven't heard of before or haven't heard much of before. And we do deep dives into the core of the work. And I try to let the author's voice speak as much as possible. And we look at cosmologies and grand unified theories and magnum opuses and tour de forces, grand theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, and then, let you rip with them and hope that they can help you to fulfill your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, shifting your paradigms, and awakening to 5D consciousness. Today is our 31st video on the book called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? And this is a history of a couple of groups of jazz musicians in Chicago in the mid-20th century who articulated cosmologies and grand unified theories of music, of the holistic mission for music, kind of recanting their entertainer and artist vocations and embracing a more spiritual approach. We're in the epilogue of this book, which is primarily autobiographical, and there's a discussion about a history class that was being taught that posited the end of the world, that the end of the world had already occurred. And just like the title of the book, It's After the End of the World, Don't You Know That Yet? Which was a little chant that the Sun Ra Orchestra used on their audiences. So we'll take over right here. Even more subtly, the car fulfilled its quest for white supremacy once Henry Ford began to realize its potential. Mass production joined up with propaganda more systematically during World War I in the Committee on Public Information. Through mass production, the car became an instrument for the white Protestant middle class to escape the riffraff, the increasingly black population of the inner city. Henry Ford envisioned the potential of the mass-produced car in America, which only came to fruition indirectly through Adolf Hitler. Hitler studied and greatly admired Ford, and Hitler's Autobahn and Volkswagen in turn inspired American statesmen like Eisenhower. Connections with Hitler go much deeper within this strain. Both America and Nazi Germany sensed the formula for totalitarianism and sought to make it happen. In the US, however, the job was more subtle. Walt Disney, for example, had been highly revered as an American creative genius, maybe, but he also made company with some of Hitler's worst henchmen and was instrumental in putting together military propaganda for the burgeoning totalitarian military state in the 1940s. Disney, moreover, put together image after image of white supremacy and colored inferiority in his wholesome and cutesy cartoon films. The fast food industry came a little later, but put together a package similar to motion pictures built on the automobile infrastructure, which, it must be remembered, was heavily subsidized by the government, despite the doctrine of laissez-faire. The auto industry, the film industry, and a consumer's mindset created the environment for the Roaring '20s, the Jazz Age. First, recall that American inner cities, in spite of the white Protestant elite and the self-congratulation of the progressives, were controlled by organized crime. The mob and/or political machines flourished in black neighborhoods, notwithstanding or even because of the efforts of progressives to clean up the cities. This cleaning was superficial, usually creating a kind of coalition at the top between the mob and the police. In one case, the struggle created the speakeasy, where black culture was first widely disseminated to the American white upper middle class. The movements of the 1920s provide even more evidence of the world being over. As historians, we can see the twin policies of transgression and denial. At the same time that the Third Reich was laying its foundation in Germany, the U.S. birthed the more subtle two-party totalitarian state with a race-based caste system, which can be summarized by the term Nazi, not here, with a significant overlap between the two. The Nazis were the white elite capitalists who had little sympathy for the poor, whatever color. The not-heres were those who certainly could have sympathized with minorities and poor, but did not because they were too distracted trying to gain status and too entranced by the freedom of all the technological gadgets and consumables now available. The not-heres also suffered from a guilty conscience, that they were more concerned with assuaging than actually helping the so-called oppressed. So they did not listen, but just helped in the way that they wanted. The post-war helped, in quotes. The post-war period represented an extension of the white supremacist world, such that it began to represent a real threat to dominate the world abroad and dominate domestically through technological mind control. The creeping incursions and transgressions of the auto industry are much easier for historians to recognize than participants in the actual events. And since the phenomenon is still going on, historians may be too involved with their own cars to notice the toll that the auto has taken in terms of freedom and health. Just wait. They also might not notice because of their nostalgic clinging to the feel-good moralizing of Walt Disney. The historians failed to notice the effects of the fast food industry, however, because they do not see it as their job. To most historians, consumption is a secondary issue. But if you believe that it is after the end of the world, then you know that the only place to accurately locate history is in and on our own bodies. Only by examining our own habits and those of people around us will we be able to tell the difference between history and propaganda. This was a key element in the class that made it worthwhile for everyone. Through selections on sugar, alcohol, tobacco, the histories of sugar, alcohol, tobacco, fast food, cocaine, heroin, caffeine, chocolate, cannabis, and psilocybin, we tried to uncover the hidden history of consumption. We also studied the ramifications of advertising, the center and focus of consumption. Advertising and all of these indulgences and addictions have a history that is de-emphasized by today's manufacturers. Being informed of this history sheds light on the nature of how these products are reckoned today. And certainly this was written, 25 or so years ago. They would probably be adding the pharma products onto this list as well. For example, none of my students knew the history of sugar and how it is inseparable from the history of slavery. None knew that heroin was allowed and enabled by the FBI when the mob tried to place it on the streets of the inner city, and that the shift from heroin to cocaine addiction as the scourge of the cities had more to do with U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and South America, Colombia, than with the emergence of foreign drug cartels. Most students took the car and advertising for granted, not understanding their nature as effects and causes. Their ignorance, however, was probably most relieved by the study of Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation. The book starts with the origins of the industry in World War II era Southern California. Same place Ray Kroc, Walt Disney, and several burgeoning war machine contractors were solidifying their operations on the government dole. The industry capitalized on organized labor's profit-sharing compromises with elite management. In return for heavy working hours, the union members were allowed entry into the lower middle class. A house with gadgets in the suburbs, a car, the accoutrements of whiteness. As part of this scheme, a few clever businessmen realized that these overworked people needed convenience and they needed service. As a result, entrepreneurs created a kind of restaurant that was designed to allow lower middle class people to afford to eat restaurant food. People flocked to the restaurants for both the convenience and service. Over time, however, the companies demonstrated a lack of accountability by producing food of poor quality that was damaging to health. The fast food industry also took the auto industry fascism to its logical conclusion by using the federal highway system as its primary distribution network. Using high technology as their modus operandus, the fast food industry established an empire by using satellite photography to find the best spot off the highway, to place their restaurants by using various high technology methods to cook their food, by attempting to vertically integrate to control the efficiency and output of their product, by using the chemical perfume industry to make the food taste or to make the food smell like anything they wanted it to, even after processing out the product's natural taste. By using advertising to emotionally trick children ages 3 to 9 into pressuring their parents and into driving them to the restaurant. The fast food industry has been another blot on American history because it is so bad for you, your physical and mental health, your workplace safety, your environment, and American and world culture. At the same time, the uniformity has made fast food an indispensable convenience that makes health a secondary concern. Wherever the fast food industry went, obesity rates, pollution, crime, and disease all followed. All for the sake of service, convenience, and taste, which was chemically induced. People learned to ignore their health for the short term, gambling against the time-release afflictions inherent in the food. From the class's perspective, the fast food industry committed remote violence. After looking at the fast food industry, the auto industry, and their partners in the advertising mass media, many students were incredulous. How could all of these atrocities have occurred with nobody doing anything about it? A few, in fact, used the circular argument that these authors were lying to them because if they were telling the truth, they would have heard of it by now. Few students really knew anything about this, and so we attempted to find out why. It would be perhaps too time-consuming to read a whole volume of Noam Chomsky on critical media studies, but an excellent short summary is provided by David Edwards's Burning All Illusion, at least for this class. Burning All Illusions, particularly chapter 1. In that chapter, Edwards details Chomsky's and Herman's propaganda model for media control. This Herculean effort for any non-super rich person to be able to control a media entity with a sizable distribution. And again, this is pre-internet, or at least pre-social media. This amounts to allowing the super rich to police themselves. Second, advertising pays for such a large amount of media's existence that they can threaten to undermine unfavorable stories by pulling their ads. Any media entity that ignores advertising will be hard-pressed to compete in the marketplace or even survive. Third, large institutions like the U.S. Army can print and distribute their own in-house propaganda and package it like news. Other media entities will then take the Army's word for it and disseminate the propaganda further. Fourth, if a would-be honest reporter or media writes or publishes an unfavorable story, then they will receive flack, which will hamper or eliminate future stories from the offending party. Finally, any offending story that does get out will be derided as being in league with the evil empire, currently terrorism, formerly communism, also drugs. Throw in Satan. This system provides the basis for an airtight model which may otherwise resemble a conspiracy. The propaganda model did well to provide logical explanations to the students' unsolved dilemmas, and it also pointed to important historical events that were not covered by the media or by general historical treatments, such as the East Timor massacre in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in which the U.S. government allowed, encouraged, and provided arms for the massacre of over 200,000 East Timorese, 1/3 of their population, and the COINTELPRO operation, where in the 1960s, the FBI successfully began to stake out, threaten, and attack civil rights leaders all the way from Martin Luther King to the Black Panthers. Indeed, Chomsky illustrates or demonstrates our profound omissions and misrepresentations associated with the civil rights movement. Many of our historians who lived through and participated in these events suffer from a nostalgic romanticism for the events. Over 30 years later, they still believe that the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the women's movement all worked or even won. Worse, some even believed that these movements sustained themselves, ignoring widespread backlash and co-optation in the ensuing decades. Howard Zinn was certainly guilty of this as well. So in class, we learned about Thomas Frank's concept of cool, which posits that the counterculture of the 1960s was never authentic, but was in fact formulated by large, if smaller and or foreign companies like Volkswagen, Pepsi, and Volvo, who decided to capitalize on a general zeitgeist of opposition against the bureaucratic authoritarian advertising of the big three automakers and Coca-Cola, for example. Another more recent example of this is the pirate's skull and crossbones symbol, a symbol of revolt. It is the symbol of Queen Elizabeth's private army, the East India Company, displayed in a blue background in the upper left of its flag that otherwise has 13 red and white stripes. You can see that picture which hangs in a palace in Madras, India, and it is dated at 1600, a good 175 years before our 13 red and white striped flag with a blue background was invented by Betsy Ross. The image propagated to the suburbs by cool companies borrowed directly from the Cool Bop school of musicians and writers, who borrowed directly from the Hard Bop school of hip black musicians. All mocked authority with outrageous lampooning of the square, waspy suburban middle class. The musicians in bop inspired a buzz of anti-authoritarian expressionism. But before that feeling could form itself organically, burgeoning corporations stepped in to make sure that consumer culture would not be recognized as authoritarian. That also occurred in rock and roll, thus a new type of false consciousness, where people thought they were rebelling but were actually solidifying the powers that be through the use and endorsement of their products and way of life originated. This concept of cool harks back to the 1930s radio, where black jazz musicians used their countercultural music to sell addictive hegemonic items. The so-called civil rights movement was misrepresented even worse by historians. Once again, historians have been nostalgic about the actions they participated in. They remember the March on Washington, the Voting Rights Act, and many actions of so-called democracy. They probably even remember some of the assassinations, and then remember that the movement kind of went away. Things kind of got crazy after MLK and RFK were shot. When the trance sets in that they believe that things are much better now, they may not remember that a lot of the movement stopped, but not that it was due to the FBI and to a rock and roll and media shutdown, not because things had gotten better. Things indeed were different after the 1960s, but that does not mean that they were better. For those blacks who tried to assimilate in some way, things may have improved in terms of economics, but to get ahead, people usually had to sell out. For those unable or unwilling to assimilate, poverty and injustice continued and continues to this day. This is more of a matter of hegemony than race. Just ask the black creative musicians. In fact, one of the key elements of trance in the 20th century US culture was the virtual substitutions of sports and rock and roll for black music. In the years after World War II, due largely to radio and record companies, black, especially male youth, were drawn towards sports, post Jackie Robinson, and even before, while black popular music was amalgamated with Southern hillbilly music or with a much smaller group of white leftist intellectuals in bebop. Any black musician who resisted this trend toward found themselves trapped and censored in the inner city. Another major element of the historical trance was the evolution of the word freedom in the years after World War I. Again, there was a deft shift in the understanding of freedom set in place to cover up various weaknesses in the system. Repeating the idea of free land, which set the table in the Homestead Act of 1862, and a smaller trend in the 1920s and 30s, the word freedom became equated with freedom to consume. No longer the pursuit of happiness. The consumer culture defined choice by the amount of different brand names that the customer could buy if they could afford it. If you couldn't afford it, though, you probably tried to anyway on the installment plan. If not, you probably lived an isolated rural or inner city existence. Indeed, consumer goods as freedom became such a central talisman that rural and inner city folks cited their use as a sign of how far they'd come. Again, however, goods as freedom were largely the result of another form of remote violence, the people's blind imitation of corporately concocted trends that ventured to teach etiquette and morals on air through peer pressure and authoritarian pressure. The government stepped in the next decade as freedom diversified into freeways, primarily as a veil to move the white people to the suburbs and to restrict blacks to the inner cities, using Hitler's Autobahn as the model. The government refused to punish the corporate conspiracy to take away mass transit from the cities so that people would be dependent upon cars. A federal court found General Motors, Firestone, and several other companies guilty of conspiring to and buying out and destroying mass transit systems in over 100 cities in the United States. They were found guilty, but assessed only a token fine of $3. By the 1960s, the freedom incantation had also become free love and a general freedom for the right to pleasure. The hidden violence within this is that the cool generation of the 1960s and the feminists of the 1970s were both able to justify their own pleasure over the pain and suffering of any number of remote groups. Another end of the world factor to mix in here is that people knew but tried to repress the fact that there was injustice and corruption in the government and media. These problems were always greatly underestimated and were hoped to be fixed through so-called reform. The Watergate charade stands as an obvious example. By scapegoating a few guilty politicians, including the president, the people were able to evade the unpleasant truth that the corruption, the conspiracy, was systemic. Reform not only made things better, perhaps more tolerable or palatable, but it made things more entrenched. The Reform tradition goes way back, but became massive in the wake of Darwinism. The progressive movement of the early 20th century became an inspiration for a whole century of reformers. The Reform movement, however, was riddled throughout by not hear white supremacy. For example, vice was the scourge of all big cities, where small-time peddlers of contraband had widespread local influence. But after the progressives sought to, quote, clean up the cities, they shut down local operators. In typical not here fashion, little did the progressives and their followers know that the vice industry cleaned up by simply consolidating and relocating, only this time to the black part of town where few whites ventured. The progressives got credit for reforming the cities, but the vice trade continued and led to the formation of black ghettos. Black urban denizens had to deal with the influx of criminal syndicates and also white thrill seekers who infiltrated the area to seek vice. The police, happy with the decline in crime in the non-black areas, were largely complicit in the new regime. In terms of the end of the world being upon us, we also have to look into the rise of a permanent wartime economy. Textbook historians offhandedly mention this new goal and its importance for morale and business, but rarely is any discussion given to the remote violence involved. If we have a permanent wartime economy, then what shall our war-making sectors do to keep busy? Obviously, some of this energy will be spent on maintaining a military presence throughout the world and what you call the endless wars, the endless proxy wars. The U.S. wanted to have the capability to act unilaterally anywhere in the world. The aspect of remote violence in this case, however, was possibly more pernicious, for it was in the mind. The war machine used the incantation of defense in order to quadruple their military budget, such that it made up over half the total government budget. In marketing, the marketing idea was to create a massive fear of communism, the so-called Red Scare. In typical not-see fashion, officials were unable to see or pretended not to see the damage that a massive campaign of fear would do to the sanity of a nation. They should have, however, since the same thing on a smaller scale occurred after World War I. By the 1950s, there was such pressure and a hostility against communism that the left, communist or not, was often targeted and was basically eliminated from the public discourse. Dissenters of the war machine were either executed, jailed, or forced underground. In spite of their silence, though, this must have been a large group, judging by the 6.6 million people who were investigated by HUAC, the House Un-American Activities at this time. Paranoia and guilt was what underlay these decisions. It was clear that this was a karmic reaction to military propaganda. And again, so this is kind of like an anti-war approach, but McCarthy was not mentioned, and earlier was Nixon was brought up as a scapegoat, and McCarthy as well as a scapegoat. You take down, you throw one person or one small group under the bus, and that distracts everybody, and they go after that person, and even the people that are kind of in a fairly similar position, the war machine gets to hide, or it doesn't get attacked because they threw McCarthy out there as a sacrificial lamb. But anyway, I'm sure other people might have different ideas about that. And again, this was written, before the turn of the century. So, it's things have changed in a huge way, but they have also stayed the same. So, they've stayed the same, I think, because they've been the same, but they've changed because the propaganda is kind of targeted in a different direction. And so we'll see, how all this fits in as the future unfolds. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Come back tomorrow, and I think we'll be finishing this in a day or two, and then we're going to move into more of the reciprocal church. I think we're going to do kind of an expose on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then move into a full-on Bible decode, starting with the New Testament. I believe we're going to look at a couple themes, and then we're probably going to go over the book of Luke with decodes. And I don't know where we'll go from there. We're definitely going to try to do the book of Revelation, and maybe an epistle or two, or maybe all of them at once. But we'll see. And then, the New Testament, the Old Testament will be further down the line. But thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.